And thank you for staying with us. Former FBI Director James Comey was arraigned this morning and pleaded not guilty to 2 felony charges. Our Washington correspondent Luis Eduardo Martinez has the details.
Earlier today at 10 a.m., former FBI Director James Comey was arraigned here at the Albert Bryan Federal Courthouse of the Eastern District of Virginia. Judge Michael Nachmanoff read the 2 felony charges that James Comey is facing. The first one for providing false testimony to Congress, and the second one for obstructing a congressional investigations. These refer to testimony that James Comey provided to the Senate Judiciary Committee back in 2020. James Comey was then asked by senators whether he had authorized information from FBI investigations to be leaked to the press, which he denied. And now, of course, prosecutor U.S. Attorney Lindsey Halligan is arguing that that testimony was false and it thus also obstructed a congressional investigation.
Seen enough on Comey that I think that he deserves a day in court. I believe that there's been sufficient evidence that has emerged that would show potential wrongdoing. Obviously, Comey deserves due process, as does anyone else.
Democratic lawmakers are arguing that the trial against former FBI Director James Comey is political persecution of Trump's rivals.
Donald Trump and the administration continues to weaponize the Department of Justice and are engaging in this effort, unprecedented in nature, to go after perceived political enemies like James Comey.
Republican lawmakers are actually insisting on further charges to be levied against former FBI Director James Comey, in particular for Operation Arctic Frost. On Tuesday, the Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Senator Chuck Grassley revealed that at least 8 Republican lawmakers were being surveilled by the FBI during the Biden administration and under the leadership of former FBI Director James Comey.
Why are we looking at Comey? Because he ran an FBI and personally knew about exculpatory information and let it slide. You tell me why my phone records, when I'm the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, were sought by the Jack Smith agents.
It's important to note that Judge Michael Nachmanoff, who is overseeing this trial, was a Biden appointee from 2021. After today's arraignment hearing, the judge set the start of the trial for January 5th of 2026. Reporting from Alexandria, Virginia, Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Joining us to discuss this case further is Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So Hans, good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us. Can you give us your overall thoughts on this case? Former FBI Director James Comey pleading not guilty to the charges.
Well, you know, that's no surprise that he did that. On the other hand, you know, it's pretty clear today that he did not tell the truth to Congress when, for example, he was asked whether he had authorized any leaks. Now, don't forget that the Inspector General of the Justice Department a number of years ago actually issued a report criticizing him for doing that. So it's not just the Trump administration saying that he actually did engage in leaks, but even the Inspector General of the Justice Department accused him of doing the same. Now, keep in mind, these kind of cases, lying to Congress can be very hard to prove. You have to show that the individual knew what they were saying was false, that they intended to deceive Congress, members of the committee. That can sometimes be a tough hurdle to cross if the questions that were asked and the responses were not crystal clear. And if they're murky and ambiguous, sometimes it's very difficult to get a conviction with these kind of cases.
Do you think perhaps maybe that's why he pleaded not guilty, because he understands that this case could be very difficult to prove?
Yes, I think so. Now, remember, too, that the indictment's very short. It was filed just before the 5-year statute of limitations would have run. There is a possibility that we might get a superseding indictment. In other words, a new indictment to replace the one that's already been filed, and it might have more charges and more information in it, particularly now that questions have been raised about Operation Arctic Frost and the just unbelievable tactic that the FBI was spying on U.S. senators. I mean, that's so outrageous, it's just shocking.
How strong do you think this case is against Comey?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
How strong is this case against Comey?
Oh, well, like I said, I think in these cases, I think they've got the evidence to put forward, but whether they can convince a jury of it, I don't know. They are fortunate that they were able to file this in Virginia, not in the District of Columbia. In the District of Columbia, the juries are so biased that they would have had no chance of convicting him. They were only able to file it in Virginia, even though this is about testimony before Congress, because of COVID. Comey was testifying remotely from Virginia. So they are fortunate in that respect. But again, these kind of cases, providing false information to Congress, they can be very difficult to prove, even when you think you have a fairly solid case.
So as you know, a trial date is now set for early January. Can you talk to us about what are we likely to see take place in the meantime?
Yeah, well, his lawyer, Comey's lawyer, has already said that he's going to be filing a series of motions. He's going to be arguing that this is a vindictive prosecution, that there is not sufficient evidence for the indictment to even have been brought, because the indictment is, it's kind of vague. You have to try to figure out exactly what was going on in it. He's probably also going to argue that there isn't sufficient information in the indictment for his client to be able to properly defend himself. That could be cleared up with a superseding indictment. He's also apparently going to argue that the acting U.S. attorney, Ms. Halligan, was improperly and unlawfully appointed, and therefore the indictment is void and invalid since she is the one who signed it. I don't know the merits of that particular claim, but he's already said he's going to raise it.
So let's say if Comey is indeed found guilty, what would be the implications of that? What would be the ripple effects?
Well, he could have penalties imposed on him. He could spend several years in jail, I think up to 5 years in jail. And I think the American people, many of whom have been saying for years, all these terrible actions, all this abuse happens in Washington, nobody ever gets punished for it. I think the American people would think, finally, someone's been punished. On the other hand, this would be a message to federal employees that they cannot get away with the kind of abuse that we saw happen during the Biden administration and also before that. And I think it's very important that we see that federal officials, federal employees, when they engage in wrongdoing, that they are held accountable for that wrongdoing.
Okay, Hans, one last question. How would you respond to the argument or the idea that the Trump administration is actually weaponizing the DOJ?
I don't think it's weaponization when you are investigating and prosecuting individuals who abused their power in the Justice Department and the FBI to actually engage in weaponization. It was James Comey and others like him who were misusing their power to go after a political opponent. And to hold them accountable for that's not weaponization. It's trying to counter what they were doing.
Okay, well, Hans, very well said today. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
A bipartisan effort in the Senate aims to counter the threats China poses to the U.S. and its allies in the Indo-Pacific. A foreign relations subcommittee is investigating illegal activities by the Chinese Communist Party. NTD's Arian Pastor has the takeaways from yesterday's hearing.
It is time to call out Beijing's behavior for what it actually is. It's illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive.
Republican Senator Pete Ricketts highlights the threat posed by China in the Indo-Pacific, warning that the U.S. must take action. Democratic Senator Chris Coons agrees, saying China is America's main national security challenge.
For years, the national security establishment has correctly identified China as our central national security challenge. Today's hearing will explore China's gray zone activities, which are increasingly offering Beijing an asymmetric advantage.
The senator says such gray zone activities have been ignored by too many administrations in the past because they fall below the threshold of armed conflict, despite violating international law. He gave a few examples.
In Australia, a U.S. treaty ally, for the first time, we saw a large Chinese naval task group conduct a full circumnavigation of the continent and live fire exercises with no warning, an enormous show of force intended to intimidate Australia and send a signal to other regional states. Against Taiwan, record levels of incursion by the PLA into Taiwanese airspace and its economic zones, brazen election interference, cutting undersea cables, and much more.
A witness at Tuesday's hearing said the solution to the problem is to develop a comprehensive national counter-strategy. That's by using diplomatic, informational, economic, legal, cyber, and security instruments against China. Senator Ricketts asked the witness, a military veteran, how the U.S. could implement these countermeasures.
When you say strategy, help us understand specifically what you mean we should be doing.
Chairman Ricketts, thank you. I think it begins with having somebody whose responsibility it is to organize the campaign. China knows how to fill in all of those gaps in our bureaucracy. So however it is that we're organized, they will organize a counter-campaign utilizing their sort of fusion, their civil-military fusion organization to sort of push into the gaps. And so we need somebody whose job it is to build the counter-ICAD strategy and then to get everybody together.
But despite China's ongoing aggression, many say the Communist Party is not as strong as it portrays itself to be. Another witness described China's many weak points.
What are some specific steps that we could do that would remind Communist China that they've got vulnerabilities as well?
Let's not forget that the Chinese are almost wholly dependent on their food needs from other countries. These are countries where the United States has tremendous diplomatic leverage. Dr. Ratner mentioned energy vulnerabilities. These are pretty severe and intense for the Chinese. But also we have to remember that the Chinese economy is currently in a state of disarray.
He added that China's economy largely depends on exports to other countries and that this economic model is highly vulnerable to sanctions. He says the U.S. needs to make clear that Chinese state-owned entities and banks could become targets of U.S. financial sanctions. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
Lawmakers said in a recent hearing that multiple U.S. administrations had failed to counter China's program of territorial expansion. Joining us to discuss is Grant Newsroom, retired U.S. Marine Colonel, former U.S. diplomat, and senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. So good afternoon to you, Grant. Tell us, what is the overarching goal here behind China's years-long campaign of territorial expansion?
Well, the overarching goal is to drive the Americans out of the Asia Pacific, all the way to the American West Coast, and ultimately for China to fill in, to dominate and control the Pacific, and ultimately to surround the United States. And they're doing very well at it. They've also set up nicely in Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, and into Africa as well. So their goals are global, but the immediate step is to get the Americans out. And that's what all this is initially about.
Do you think the U.S. or Western society know about this goal? Why has it been allowed to happen to this extent?
Well, it's been no secret. The Chinese have always been very clear about their objectives, and they telegraph their punches. And all you had to do was pay attention. But the allure of Chinese money, the China market, has been just too great. So everyone, the business class, financial class, too much of the political class, that was responsible for letting China into the World Trade Organization, giving them most favored nation status. They basically knew what was coming, but they wanted the money. And ultimately, China has launched a very effective political warfare subversion campaign to make the Americans, the rest of the free world, actually go along. There has been no consistent, coherent pushback on the Chinese until the first Trump administration, and even they were facing huge problems internally from people like the Secretary of Treasury. And so it's really the smell of Chinese money and very successful Chinese subversion against the people who might stop them. But it's been no secret. It's just been a collective decision not to recognize it. So hearings like this one they recently held is very good, but it does have an aspect of discovering gravity This has been obvious for at least the last 15 years to anyone who cared to look.
So how close is China in achieving this overarching goal?
They've still got a ways to go. But if you compare where they were 10 years ago, it's breathtaking. Their influence throughout the entire region, and this is beyond, the Western Pacific. If you look at the whole map, look at the Central Pacific. In all the Pacific Islands, there's a very impressive and strong political Chinese presence. And their influence is nonstop, and they're continuing to try and subvert. And the idea is to bring countries and even bring some U.S. territories, such as Northern Marianas, around to seeing China as the better alternative, draw them away from the United States, away from the West. So it has been very effective. And this is combined at the same time with the Chinese military buildup, which is jaw-dropping when you stop and think about it. So they can exert their influence, they can project power farther and farther. And if you play this out 5-10 years, that they're going to be an even more formidable force for us to face. And also their economic influence, as is well known, that's everywhere. And you get countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, South Korea, dependent on the China market. And well, they suddenly become a lot less strict in their dealings with the PRC. They're more willing to overlook Chinese aggression and to feel like, well, they just can't do anything because they'll upset the economic relationship. So this is a sort of a coherent, sort of concerted, multifaceted approach by the Chinese that started a long time ago. It continues apace right now, and they've done very well at it. Still got a ways to go, but if you look at the progress they've made, it's very depressing when you consider the future, unless the West and the United States wakes up and does something.
So Senator Chris Coons actually compared China's strategy to Putin's. If you think Crimea, if you think Ukraine, is that a fair comparison? Is there anything you'd like to add to that comparison?
Unfortunately, it's much worse. The Chinese are better than the Russians. Putin's efforts in Ukraine and Crimea, this is basically military. It's just hard power, sheer force. There is some subversion that's gone on, but basically this is just like a mafia boss throwing his weight around. In the case of the Chinese, they do it very differently. And the military part, the hard power part, is actually bringing up the rear. What you have at the start with the Chinese is a commercial presence that leads to political influence. It's all greased with bribery. And you create a constituency in your target country that sees China as really harmless and somebody you can do business with. And also, you'll have this constituency actually pushing Chinese interests. As I said, it's not just other countries, but you'll see this phenomenon on display in the United States, in Washington. Read Peter Schweitzer's books. And once again, back to the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. They have got a pro-China business constituency there that is very much pushing China's interests. And you have members of the political class who are also carrying China's water for them. So I say the military just comes last when it comes to the Chinese. With the case of the Russians, it comes first. So the Chinese, unfortunately, are a much tougher opponent than the Russians are.
So, Colonel, as you know, the 2016 International Court ruling invalidated China's claims in the South China Sea, for example, and yet Beijing ignored it. Can you talk to us about the effectiveness of international law in curbing China's claims?
Well, when it comes to the PRC, the effectiveness of international law is, I suppose there's some figure that's less than zero, but it doesn't really amount to much. The Chinese don't care about their reputation unless it's combined with something else, like real economic pressure, like exposing the Chinese Communist Party leadership's corruption, their overseas wealth. But a ruling itself doesn't amount to much. It could have had some effect in this case, however, and so knowing some history helps. Back in 2016, after the ruling was issued, it was overwhelmingly in the Philippines' favor. The Americans did nothing. The Obama administration, they purposely did not mention it because they didn't want to embarrass the Chinese. The idea was if they backed off, well, the Chinese would behave better. Well, the Chinese took that as a sort of a sign to let's go ahead. And also this ruling was the result of a suit filed by the Filipinos after the Chinese took over Philippine territory at Scarborough Shoal in 2012. They bamboozled the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific, Kurt Campbell. So he got the Filipinos to pull out from the Scarborough Shoals, and he accepted a Chinese promise that they would as well. The Chinese didn't. The Americans and the secretary and the administration did nothing. So you had this ruling come out. A few years later, the Americans encouraged the Filipinos to do it. They got the ruling, and the Americans did nothing. Well, that demoralized the Filipinos, again, to put it mildly. And the Chinese could size up their opponents. They saw that these were Americans and administration that would do nothing to stop them. And thus you've got this Chinese expansion that the hearing described very well. It's just gone full speed ever since. The only thing that gave them a hiccup was the first Trump administration and that very good lineup that they had handling China affairs. So knowing some history is important. It's good that you actually brought this up.
So, Colonel, as you were speaking and you saw, we were playing the footage of the confrontation between the Chinese ship and the Philippine ship. Can you describe for us the CCP's use of its Coast Guard and civilian-looking vessels and fishing fleets?
Well, the Chinese do this as a sort of a matter of course. One, they've got a lot of these ships, and also if they use them, they can then claim, well, look, this is just law enforcement action, or this is just fishing boats, not stating that it's their maritime militia, which is part of the People's Armed Police. But they use this as a tool of force, intimidation, and they have really been going all out against the Filipinos. The Filipinos, of course, are waiting for the Americans to actually show up and help them, as the treaty, they thought that the security treaty requires. And it's not just the Filipinos. The Chinese have the numbers, and they're using these resources, these ships, say, against the Japanese and against the Japanese Senkaku Islands. It's very aggressive. It continues. And they use it against the Koreans. They'll use it everywhere, but they've got the resources to do it. And the Chinese Coast Guard, the maritime militia, the fishing fleet have effectively had de facto control of the South China Sea since the late 2010s. So this is not a future problem, but it's really a tool in the Chinese toolkit, and they use it very aggressively. And also when they say, well, this is not a naval ship, it has this paralyzing effect on the Americans in particular, and Westerners in general, is they just don't know what to do. They have no response to it, instead of recognizing it for what it is, which is a tool of really Chinese military might in order to take territory, to bully and intimidate, and respond accordingly. But also don't respond always tit for tat, but you respond asymmetrically. As I mentioned earlier, expose Xi Jinping and his top cronies' wealth overseas, and that will get their attention very quickly. It's just one tool. So you can economic sanctions, stop allowing any technology exports to China. Don't allow Chinese investments in the United States of any sort. And that will get their attention. China tells you what they don't like. And one of the things that scares them, one is trade, and also trade sanctions, but also the free nations getting together to defend themselves in unison. They hate that, and they will tell you that. So look at what the Chinese complain about and do more of it. And you'll have a pretty good strategy to employ.
Okay, Colonel, we just have a tiny bit of time left, and I want to squeeze in one more question here. Can you talk to us about the strategy of China building artificial islands?
Well, that they've have used this to build these huge military bases in the South China Sea, contrary to the international law, the international court's ruling, and they have gone about this since started roughly about 2013. And now they have these really very, very substantial military bases in the South China Sea. It allows them to really assert and demonstrate their control, their domination, and also you can use it for offensive operations when the time comes. When this all was happening, once again, the aforementioned Kurt Campbell didn't do much, but also you had senior American military leaders in the Pacific who knew what was coming, but they would not talk about it publicly. They would complain privately to visitors, but they wouldn't speak up about it. The US administration, the Obama administration, didn't want to say anything that would upset the Chinese. But the military leaders would even joke about this as the Great Wall of Sand, saying that they would take it out in the first hour or two of a war. Well, that sort of bold talk didn't amount to much. It didn't stop the Chinese, and they have gone all out in this island building which has really put us in a very difficult position and put our friends in an even more difficult position because they can see who seems to have the momentum, who seems to have the will to actually respond to Chinese aggression. And sometimes it looks like we're sort of lacking in this regard, but it isn't something that appeared yesterday. It's been going on for about the last 12, 13 years. And as I said, the most senior U.S. military officers in Washington and in the Pacific really ought to return whatever end of tour awards they received for their performance here. This didn't happen as the result of leprechauns at work, but it was really, unfortunately, American officials, uniformed and civilian, who allowed this to happen. And we did not push back, partly fearing, well, we would lose Chinese money from the China market. And we've gotten ourselves into this mess, and now we dig ourselves out of it. We still have cards to play. But it is important to remember how we got here, who got us here, and to now, one, not listen to their advice anymore, but actually go about rolling the Chinese back, putting them on the back foot. And as I mentioned earlier, you do have, when you hear these so-called gray zone operations by the Chinese that hamstring and paralyze the West and the Americans, well, look at these as acts of war and respond accordingly. Anything else isn't going to get you very far with the PRC. So you can't blame the Chinese for taking advantage of a confused opponent. But you do have to wake up and start responding in a way that the Chinese understand and appreciate.
Okay, well, Colonel, well said. As always, we appreciate you coming on to talk to us about this.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
The Supreme Court is hearing arguments in a lawsuit challenging an Illinois law that governs how mail-in ballots received after Election Day are counted. The case is about who can challenge this law rather than about the process of counting mail-in ballots. Joining us to discuss this is Keith Gross, former assistant state attorney and prosecutor in the state of Florida. Keith is also a legal analyst. So Keith, good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us. Can you talk to us big picture-wise? How significant is this case in the grand scheme of things?
Well, so far, it's not particularly significant, but what we're seeing in the early stages is pretty typical, where the court argues that the parties before it lack standing, which is often frustrating to those of us on the outside watching because it means the court may not get to the merits of the case itself.
Okay, Keith, can you give us a brief overview of the main arguments here for those who are not very legal savvy?
Well, when you look at who has the right to vote and who has the right to challenge that, it really hinges on the court's analysis of whether or not the parties who bring the lawsuit are in fact directly affected and directly harmed by whatever it is they're seeking to undo. The court looks at many of these arguments and they say, well, the person before us currently who is bringing this is not directly harmed, and therefore they lack standing to bring the issue.
Okay, were there any indications of the leanings of the justices, which way they're showing preference to?
Not that I could see, but it's very frequent that you'll see cases like this dismissed for lack of standing. We saw a lot of cases where the 2020 election results were being challenged in court. Most of those cases were dismissed, not because the merits showed that there was no issue with the 2020 election, but because the court ruled that the party bringing the case lacked standing.
Can you also speak to, previously lower courts actually threw out this case, right? What were the reasons for that?
Those cases were generally thrown out for lack of standing, because in order to bring a case like this, you've got to demonstrate a concrete injury that is ripe for the court to address. If there's no way for the court to grant the relief being sought, then there's no case to hear, and the court says that they lack jurisdiction because of the lack of standing.
So, Keith, the American Civil Liberties Union supports this appeal as a right to bring a lawsuit of this kind, would also apply to civil rights groups. Can you talk to us about the impact here? What could this case mean for the future of lawsuits over voting procedures?
Well, it could really change who has the ability to enforce those constitutional rights, the right to vote. When you look at a situation where you've got a third party, a group, an organization like the ACLU, generally they're bringing the case on behalf of their members. Now, courts have generally recognized that groups can bring cases on behalf of their members if those members would have standing. We've seen this a lot in other contexts, and we're going to see a further analysis of that under this case with regard to the ACLU and whether or not the underlying members have the legal right to challenge these laws.
Is there any intersection between the federal law governing the timing of elections with state laws that permit counting of ballots after Election Day?
There's a little bit of gray area there. Generally, elections are controlled by the states. The Constitution doesn't give the federal government the power to control state elections. There's some overlap and some gray area with regard to federal elections, however, and what standards may be enforced regarding federal elections. So there are a lot of people in Washington who want to ensure that federal elections include only valid citizens as voters, and there are many states who think that it's okay to allow non-citizens to vote, and many states and municipalities who allow non-citizens to vote in state and municipal elections. The federal government could assert its interest in securing the federal elections, but may stay out of the state election component.
So, Keith, would you mind speaking to the outcomes of this case potentially? And depending on that outcome, what could happen next?
One of the things that really hangs in the balance is whether or not the fate of the United States government will be decided by citizens or non-citizens. If states are able to allow non-citizens to vote, and if the court doesn't allow a real hearing on the merits with regard to this, we could see an odd situation where the federal government and the state government are at odds about who is allowed to vote. Ultimately, if we believe our elections should only include U.S. citizens, it's important that states all align with federal policy to block non-citizens from voting.
Okay, just one final question, Keith. Do you think the outcome of this case could impact other states with similar laws?
Certainly it could. It depends. Generally speaking, the only areas where this case would be binding would be those areas within the same appellate jurisdiction. That said, when there is an appellate court decision striking down something like this or declaring that it is permissible, you're likely to see it travel on and this case to be heard further in the Supreme Court, particularly if you see different results from different appellate courts. If, say, the appellate court on one side of the country decides a different result than the appellate court on the other side of the country, that's something called a circuit split, and that generally encourages the Supreme Court to get involved and resolve the conflict.
Well, all right, Keith, well said. We really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have breaking news. Derek Groves, who escaped from a New Orleans jail in May, has been captured in Atlanta. The U.S. Marshal Service says law enforcement captured him after a standoff at a home in the southwestern part of Atlanta. He was found hiding in the residence. Groves then was the last of 10 inmates to be captured after breaking out of the New Orleans Paris jail, which was one of the most high-profile jailbreaks in Louisiana in decades. Groves was convicted of second-degree murder and serving life in prison. He shot and killed 2 people and injured several others at a block party. His girlfriend has been in custody and facing charges for helping him escape. All right, taking a break now. President Trump is holding a roundtable discussion on Antifa at the White House. We have that and more after this break.